Your morality is making you worse. The ethical principles you've cultivated with such care, the clear boundaries between right and wrong you've established, the unwavering commitment to goodness you pride yourself on. These might actually be driving you toward the very darkness you're trying to avoid. This isn't provocative hyperbole, but a profound psychological insight that Carl Jung recognized through decades of clinical observation. Rigid moral dualism doesn't eliminate evil, but paradoxically strengthens it. Tonight, we continue our exploration of Jung's revolutionary psychology by examining one of his most challenging concepts: the psychological dangers of dualistic thinking, particularly regarding morality. Building on our previous discussions of the shadow, projection, the curse of consciousness, the anima and animus, prophetic dreams, the inflated ego, collective psychology, happiness-seeking, spiritual experience, the unconscious as warning system, synchronicity, and social opposition to authenticity, we now turn to Jung's radical perspective on morality itself. Why the very structure of conventional ethical thinking might create the opposite of what it intends. What you'll discover may fundamentally change your understanding of moral development and psychological integration. And by the end, you'll understand why Jung believed that truly ethical life emerges not from rigidly opposing good and evil, but from a more profound integration that transcends this dangerous dichotomy. The split that wounds. How dualistic thinking creates psychological division. To understand Jung's critique of moral dualism, we must first recognize what he identified as a fundamental feature of Western consciousness: the tendency to organize experience into rigid opposing categories: good, evil, light, dark, spirit, matter, rational, irrational, conscious, unconscious. This dualistic structure doesn't merely describe reality, but actively shapes how we perceive and experience it, creating psychological divisions with profound consequences. As Jung wrote in Ion, the Christ symbol lacks wholeness in the modern psychological sense, since it represents only the good, while its counterpart in the East, the Tao, unites the opposites within itself. This observation points to Jung's radical insight. The Western psychological inheritance, shaped significantly by Christian dualism, establishes a fundamental split between good and evil that creates not moral clarity, but psychological fragmentation. Rather than uniting opposites into greater wholeness, this dualism demands identification with one side while rejecting its opposite, establishing internal division that ultimately undermines the very moral development it attempts to foster. The most immediate consequence of this dualistic structure is psychological splitting, the division of the psyche into conscious aspects we identify with and unconscious aspects we reject. When morality gets organized around rigid good-evil polarities, we inevitably identify consciousness with the good pole while rejecting the evil pole into unconsciousness, creating precisely the shadow formation we've explored in previous discussions. As Jung noted in Psychology and Religion, where love rules, there is no will to power, and where power predominates, their love is lacking. The one is the shadow of the other. This statement captures the paradoxical relationship between conscious intention and unconscious compensation. The more absolutely we identify with any particular value or quality, the more powerfully its opposite develops in the unconscious. Not because these qualities are inherently opposed, but because our dualistic perception forces artificial separation that the psyche continuously attempts to correct through compensatory processes. Consider how cultures or individuals that most strongly identify with peace and nonviolence often develop unconscious fascination with violence, visible in entertainment choices or psychological symptoms, or how religious communities emphasizing sexual purity frequently experience sexual scandals reflecting unconscious compensation for conscious moral rigidity, or how political movements organized around compassionate inclusion often develop surprising cruelty toward those perceived as opposing their values. These patterns aren't merely hypocritical moral failures, but demonstrations of what Jung called enantiodromia, the psychological principle that any extreme position eventually produces its opposite. This principle operates not through supernatural punishment for pride, but through natural psychological compensation for one-sided conscious identification. As Jung explained in Psychological Types, when an extreme attitude dominates consciousness, the law of enantiodromia leads sooner or later to the emergence of the unconscious opposite. This law doesn't just operate in extreme contexts, but functions continuously throughout psychological life, creating varying degrees of division between conscious morality and unconscious compensation. The more rigid and absolute our moral dualism becomes, the more powerfully this compensation operates, often manifesting in precisely the immoral behaviors or impulses our conscious morality most strongly rejects. Consider Jonathan, a religious leader whose moral framework emphasized absolute sexual purity, and who counseled others with dogmatic certainty about maintaining rigid sexual boundaries. His conscious moral identity was constructed around complete rejection of impure sexual impulses, a rejection so absolute it prevented conscious relationship with his own sexual nature. This rigid dualism didn't eliminate his sexuality, but drove it underground, creating unconscious compensation that eventually manifested as the very sexual sin his conscious morality most strongly condemned. His moral failure wasn't merely personal weakness, but demonstration of psychological principle. The more absolutely we reject any aspect of human experience as evil, the more likely it erupts unconsciously in ways that contradict our conscious values. Jung didn't introduce this principle to justify immoral behavior or promote ethical relativism. He recognized it as psychological reality, with profound implications for genuine moral development. The dualistic approach that divides human experience into absolute good and evil doesn't actually eliminate the evil side, but drives it into unconsciousness, where it gains power precisely because it remains unacknowledged and unintegrated. This insight directly challenges conventional approaches to moral development that emphasize strengthening conscious identification with good while rejecting evil. From Jung's perspective, This approach doesn't create genuine ethical maturity, but psychological division that undermines the very morality it attempts to establish. In our next section, we'll explore the specific psychological dangers created by rigid moral dualism. But first, consider this question. How have you experienced the principle of enantiodromia in your own life? When has strong identification with particular moral positions or personal values created unconscious compensation that manifested in ways contradicting your conscious intentions? The shadow of righteousness, moral dualism's dangerous consequences. Jung identified several specific psychological dangers created by rigid moral dualism, patterns that undermine ethical development, while creating suffering for both individuals and communities. Understanding these patterns helps explain why well-intentioned moral frameworks often produce results opposite their conscious intentions. The first and perhaps most fundamental danger is what Jung called inflation, unconscious identification with archetypal patterns that overwhelms individual consciousness. Moral dualism particularly risks inflation through identification with absolute goodness, a state Jung considered psychologically perilous because it disconnects consciousness from human limitation and shadows. As he wrote in Ion, inflation may be recognized by the arrogance and overweening self-importance that stamp the inflated personality. The disastrous effects of inflation on one's human relationships need not be emphasized. This inflated moral consciousness manifests as self-righteousness, dogmatic certainty, and inability to perceive the shadow aspects of one's own moral positions. The person possessed by moral inflation doesn't simply hold ethical positions, but unconsciously identifies with absolute goodness itself, a psychological state that paradoxically makes them more likely to enact unconscious evil, precisely because they've lost awareness of their capacity for it. History repeatedly demonstrates this pattern. The most horrific atrocities have frequently been perpetrated by individuals and movements possessed by absolute moral certainty, a psychological state where identification with good becomes so complete that even the most brutal actions can be justified as serving moral purpose. From religious inquisitions to political purges, inflation through moral dualism creates the psychological conditions for extraordinary cruelty, enacted in the name of righteousness. The second danger is what Jung called projection, the unconscious attribution of disowned psychological content onto others. Moral dualism creates perfect conditions for shadow projection by establishing rigid boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable qualities, forcing the latter into unconsciousness, where they become prime material for projection. As Jung noted in the Archetypes and the collective unconscious, projections change the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. This projection manifests as the peculiar certainty that evil resides primarily in others, rather than oneself, a perception that reflects not moral clarity, but psychological blindness to one's own shadow. The more absolutely someone identifies with good through dualistic morality, the more completely they project evil outward, creating distorted perception that mistakes psychological projection for objective reality. Consider how political discourse increasingly portrays opposing viewpoints not just as different perspectives with potential validity, but as manifestations of absolute evil requiring complete rejection. Or how religious communities often locate moral corruption exclusively in other faiths or the secular world, rather than acknowledging the universal human capacity for both ethical and unethical behavior. Or how individuals convinced of their moral superiority perceive criticism not as potentially valuable feedback, but as attack from those who don't understand their righteous position. These projection patterns don't reflect mere disagreement, but psychological process where unconscious shadow material gets externalized through dualistic frameworks that prevent integration of the complete human psychological spectrum. The result isn't ethical clarity, but distorted perception that mistakes subjective projection for objective reality, creating conditions for conflict justified by moral certainty while preventing the self-awareness essential for genuine ethical development. The third danger is what Jung called possession, the state where consciousness becomes overtaken by unconscious content without awareness of this influence. Moral dualism creates ideal conditions for possession by establishing psychological patterns that separate consciousness from unconscious material so completely that the latter can influence behavior without conscious recognition. This possession manifests as the disturbing phenomenon where people committing clearly unethical actions remain convinced of their moral rightness, not through conscious hypocrisy, but through genuine inability to perceive the contradiction between their behavior and espoused values. The psychological division created by rigid dualism prevents integration that would make such contradictions conscious, allowing unconscious shadow to operate without conscious awareness of its influence. Consider religious leaders preaching sexual morality while engaging in secret sexual misconduct, politicians advocating financial integrity while accepting corrupt payments, or social justice advocates behaving abusively while fighting abuse, not necessarily through conscious hypocrisy, but often through genuine psychological division that prevents conscious awareness of the contradiction. This division doesn't result from individual moral failure, but from the psychological structure of dualism itself, which creates conditions where dissociated shadow material can influence behavior without conscious recognition. The fourth, and perhaps most destructive danger, is what Jung called psychic infection, the unconscious transmission of psychological states between individuals that can rapidly spread through groups. Moral dualism creates ideal conditions for such infection by establishing shared projections that align individual shadow material with collective psychological patterns. As Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, the great events of world history are, at bottom, profoundly unimportant. In the last analysis, the essential thing is the life of the individual. This alone makes history. Here alone do the great transformations first take place, and the whole future, the whole history of the world ultimately spring as a gigantic summation from these hidden sources in individuals. These hidden sources can create either positive transformation or destructive manifestation depending on the degree of conscious integration. When moral dualism establishes rigid good-evil divisions at collective levels, it creates conditions where shared shadow projections can rapidly escalate into devastating group behavior, from historical atrocities to contemporary polarization that prevents productive engagement across difference. The combined effect of these dangers explains Jung's radical assessment that conventional moral dualism often undermines the very ethical development it attempts to foster, not because morality itself is problematic, but because dualistic structure creates psychological conditions that strengthen precisely the shadow elements it attempts to eliminate through conscious rejection. In our next section, we'll explore Jung's alternative vision, a more integrated approach to ethical development that transcends rigid dualism without abandoning genuine moral discernment. But first, consider this question. How have you observed these psychological dangers of moral dualism in contemporary culture? Where do you see inflation, projection, possession, or psychic infection manifesting through rigid, good-evil divisions in social, political, or religious contexts? Beyond good and evil, Jung's vision of integrated ethical development. If rigid moral dualism creates psychological dangers that undermine ethical development, what alternative did Jung propose? His vision wasn't ethical relativism that abandons moral discernment, but a more integrated approach that transcends dualistic splitting while maintaining genuine ethical orientation, what he sometimes called moral realism, as distinct from either moral absolutism or moral relativism. As Jung wrote in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. This moral effort differs fundamentally from conventional dualistic morality. Rather than strengthening conscious identification with good while rejecting evil into unconsciousness, it develops conscious relationship with the complete human psychological spectrum, including aspects conventional morality labels as darkness or evil. The first principle of this integrated approach involves what Jung called shadow integration, developing conscious relationship with precisely the aspects of humanity that dualistic morality attempts to eliminate through rejection. This integration doesn't mean acting on every impulse or abandoning ethical discernment, but bringing previously unconscious material into consciousness where it can be related to, rather than either expressed blindly or projected externally. Practice this integration by asking questions like, what qualities or impulses does my moral framework reject most absolutely? How might these manifest in my own psychology despite my conscious rejection? What purpose might these qualities serve when consciously integrated rather than unconsciously expressed or projected? These questions begin developing relationship with shadow material that dualistic morality keeps unconscious through rigid rejection. Consider Rebecca, whose political activism was motivated by genuine commitment to creating more just society. Her dualistic moral framework identified certain perspectives as absolutely wrong, allowing no possibility of legitimate value in opposing viewpoints. This absolutism created unconscious shadow that manifested as surprising cruelty toward ideological opponents, behavior that contradicted her conscious values but emerged from psychological splitting her dualistic morality established. Through difficult inner work, she developed more integrated approach that maintained strong ethical commitment while acknowledging her own capacity for the very qualities she opposed in others. This integration didn't weaken her moral conviction, but transformed it from unconscious projection to conscious discernment, allowing her to oppose genuinely harmful perspectives while recognizing the universal human capacity for both constructive and destructive behavior. The second principle involves what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, maintaining conscious awareness of psychological polarities without prematurely resolving their tension through either-or thinking. This capacity doesn't eliminate distinction between constructive and destructive behavior, but recognizes that genuine ethical discernment emerges through engaging complexity, rather than reducing it to absolute categories. Practice this capacity by intentionally holding awareness of both sides of moral polarities, not to eliminate ethical discernment, but to ground it in psychological reality, rather than dualistic abstraction. When strongly identifying with particular moral position, intentionally consider what legitimate value might exist in the opposite perspective. What shadow elements might be present in my own position despite its conscious ethical intent? This questioning doesn't abandon moral commitment, but grounds it in psychological wholeness rather than splitting. The third principle involves what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity for new, more comprehensive consciousness to emerge through holding psychological tension rather than eliminating it through dualistic division. This function doesn't compromise between ethical positions, but transcends their apparent opposition through more integrated perspective that includes both poles within larger wholeness. Practice this function by approaching ethical questions, not as problems to be solved through applying predetermined moral categories, but as invitations to develop more comprehensive consciousness through engaging their inherent tension. Rather than immediately classifying situations as good or evil, right or wrong, approach complex ethical questions with genuine curiosity. What more comprehensive understanding might emerge if I hold this tension rather than immediately resolving it through familiar moral categories? The fourth principle involves developing what Jung called symbolic consciousness, the capacity to perceive symbolic dimensions of experience rather than only literal aspects. This consciousness recognizes that moral language about good and evil doesn't merely describe objective external reality, but expresses psychological patterns that transcend literal categories. This symbolic awareness doesn't abandon ethical discernment, but grounds it in psychological understanding that transcends literal dualism. It recognizes that good and evil represent not just external behaviors, but psychological patterns requiring integration rather than merely opposition. What dualistic morality attempts to accomplish through division, ethical behavior, symbolic consciousness, approaches through integration that eliminates neither pole but transforms both through conscious relationship. Consider Jonathan, whose religious morality established absolute division between flesh and spirit, identifying the former as source of sin requiring rejection and the latter as exclusive location of divine connection. This dualism didn't eliminate his physical nature, but drove it underground, creating psychological division that eventually manifested as precisely the sins of the flesh his conscious morality most strongly condemned. Through difficult psychological and spiritual work, he developed more integrated understanding that transcended this dualism without abandoning genuine ethical discernment. He recognized that biblical language about flesh and spirit expressed symbolic psychological patterns requiring integration rather than literally separate categories demanding division. This symbolic consciousness transformed his morality from rigid division that strengthened unconscious shadow to integrated awareness that maintained ethical orientation without psychological splitting. These principles don't eliminate ethical discernment or suggest all behaviors are equally valid. They offer a more psychologically integrated approach to moral development, one that maintains commitment to constructive values while recognizing that genuinely ethical life emerges not from rigid opposition between absolute good and evil, but from conscious integration of the complete human psychological spectrum. As Jung wrote in Psychology and Religion, "How can I be substantial if I do not cast a shadow? I must have a dark side also if I am to be whole. And inasmuch as I become conscious of my shadow, I also remember that I am a human being like any other." This wholeness represents not absence of moral discernment, but its psychological maturation beyond dualistic splitting that paradoxically strengthens the very shadow it attempts to eliminate through conscious rejection. The integrated approach doesn't abandon ethics, but transforms their psychological foundation from division that creates unconscious compensation to wholeness that enables genuine moral development. The alchemy of integration, transforming opposition into wholeness. We began with a provocative statement: your morality is making you worse. We've explored Jung's understanding of how rigid moral dualism creates psychological splitting that paradoxically strengthens unconscious shadow, identified specific dangers this splitting produces, and outlined principles for more integrated approach to ethical development. Now we arrive at Jung's most profound insight about the relationship between morality and psychology, one that completely transforms how we might understand ethical development. Jung believed that the most destructive aspects of human behavior don't emerge from absence of moral values, but from their dualistic structure, the psychology of rigid opposition that creates the very evil it attempts to eliminate through conscious rejection. The alternative isn't abandoning moral discernment, but transforming its psychological foundation from dualistic opposition to alchemical integration. As Jung wrote in Mysterium Conjunctionis, the integration of the shadow, or the realization of the personal unconscious, marks the first stage in the analytic process. Without it, a recognition of anima and animus is impossible. The shadow can be realized only through a relation to a partner, and anima and animus only through a relation to a partner of the opposite sex, because only in such a relation do their projections become operative and visible. This statement reveals Jung's understanding that genuine ethical development proceeds not through strengthening conscious morality against unconscious shadow, but through transforming their relationship from opposition to integration. Like alchemical processes that transform base materials into more refined substances, this psychological alchemy doesn't eliminate either pole, but transforms both through their conscious relationship. The integrated approach recognizes that qualities labeled good and evil in dualistic frameworks often represent not absolute moral categories, but complementary psychological functions requiring conscious relationship rather than opposition. Capacities for aggression, sexuality, power, creativity, nurturing, structure, and transcendence all contain constructive and destructive potentials, depending not on their inherent nature, but on their psychological integration or dissociation. Consider how aggression consciously integrated serves healthy boundary setting, motivation, and protection of vulnerable others, while unconsciously expressed it manifests as either explosive violence or passive-aggressive behavior. Or how sexuality consciously integrated creates profound connection, pleasure, and creative energy, while unconsciously expressed it manifests as either compulsive acting out or rigid suppression that emerges elsewhere in distorted forms. Or how power consciously integrated enables effective leadership, necessary change, and authentic influence, while unconsciously expressed it manifests as either domination or manipulation through weakness. These examples illustrate Jung's radical insight. What creates destructive behavior isn't the presence of particular human capacities, but their psychological dissociation through dualistic frameworks that prevent conscious integration. The integrated approach doesn't eliminate ethical discernment between constructive and destructive expressions, but transforms its psychological foundation from opposition between absolute categories to discernment regarding psychological integration versus dissociation. As Jung noted in Psychology and Alchemy, there is no light without shadow and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. This statement captures a profound psychological truth that dualistic morality systematically denies. Genuine wholeness emerges not from perfection that eliminates shadow, but integration that transforms it. The most genuinely ethical individuals Jung encountered weren't those most strongly identified with absolute goodness, but those who had developed conscious relationship with their complete humanity, including aspects conventional morality labels as darkness or evil. This integrated approach creates what Jung considered genuine moral realism, ethical discernment grounded in psychological wholeness rather than splitting. This realism doesn't abandon moral commitment or suggest all behaviors are equally valid, but it grounds ethical development in conscious relationship with complete humanity, rather than identification with idealized goodness that inevitably strengthens unconscious shadow through compensation. Consider Maria, whose religious upbringing established rigid, dualistic framework centered on identification with divine goodness through rejection of human sinfulness. This dualism created psychological splitting where conscious identity organized around moral perfectionism while shadow accumulated unconsciously, eventually manifesting as psychological symptoms including anxiety, depression, and relationship difficulties that contradicted her conscious moral aspirations. Through difficult psychological and spiritual work, she developed more integrated approach that maintained genuine faith commitment while transforming its psychological structure. She discovered that authentic spiritual life emerged not from identifying with absolute goodness against human darkness, but from genuine encounter with divine wholeness that transcended this dualism entirely, a perspective reflected in Christian mystical traditions emphasizing union with God through embracing complete humanity rather than escaping it. This transformation didn't weaken her moral commitment, but profoundly strengthened it by grounding ethics in psychological integration rather than splitting. She maintained clear discernment between constructive and destructive behavior, while recognizing that genuinely ethical life emerges not from rigid opposition between absolute good and evil, but from conscious relationship with the complete human spectrum transformed through integration rather than division. As Jung wrote in Modern Man, In Search of a Soul, the right way to wholeness is made up, unfortunately, of fateful detours and wrong turnings. It is a longissima via, not straight, but serpentine, that embraces all the functions of our own being. This serpentine path toward wholeness represents Jung's vision of genuine moral development, not linear progress toward perfect goodness achieved through rejection of evil, but integrative journey that transforms the entire psychological spectrum through conscious relationship rather than dualistic opposition. The goal isn't moral perfection achieved through eliminating shadow, but psychological wholeness that transforms both light and dark aspects through their conscious integration. As you reflect on tonight's exploration of Jung's perspective on moral dualism, consider this question: how might your approach to ethical development change if you viewed it not as strengthening identification with absolute goodness against evil, but as developing more conscious relationship with your complete humanity? What shadow aspects currently unconscious through rigid moral rejection might serve constructive purposes if consciously integrated rather than either expressed unconsciously or projected externally? Remember Jung's core insight. Dualistic morality often strengthens precisely the shadow elements it attempts to eliminate through conscious rejection, not because morality itself is problematic, but because rigid good-evil division creates psychological splitting that prevents integration of the complete human spectrum. The truly ethical life emerges not from perfection achieved through eliminating shadow, but wholeness created through transforming opposition into integration. This understanding doesn't abandon moral discernment or suggest all behaviors are equally valid. It transforms ethical development from psychological splitting that paradoxically strengthens unconscious shadow to integration that enables genuine moral maturation, not by eliminating distinction between constructive and destructive behavior, but by grounding ethical discernment in psychological wholeness, rather than dualistic division that inevitably creates the very evil it consciously opposes. What might change in your life if you approached ethical development not through strengthening identification with absolute goodness against evil, but through developing more conscious relationship with your complete humanity? And how might this integrated approach transform not just personal psychology, but cultural patterns of moral polarization currently intensifying shadow projection at collective levels?